So welcome back, and here we are to start two of our regulatory roundtables, and the first one is focused on the federal regulatory considerations. And so, as I spoke about at the beginning with my talking points, is that we now have 6 million certified medical cannabis patients in the U.S., while again, with Dr. Tischler's colorful patchwork map, we all know that there is a patchwork of state regulations that just were operating in an illegal environment with cannabis classified as a Schedule I. So healthcare providers are uniquely challenged by the navigation of these federal regulations, public policy, and the impact on public health. Our roundtable experts are going to be discussing the complex federal regulatory landscape with the likely next steps and considerations. We've got the Farm Bill being readdressed in 2013. We've got conversations with safe banking, whether that's going to happen or not. We've got the 22 Medical Marijuana Cannabidiol Research Expansion Act. Is that truly going to be impactful? And so I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, Karen Jaynes, who is also a graduate of the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy, who's done an exceptional job of developing herself into a federal regulatory expert. Karen has partnered with the Council of Federal Cannabis Regulation, CFCR, where I'm part of that. Kristine is, and again, Karen. And she wrote a white paper entitled Creating Comprehensive Informed Cannabis Regulation, a conversation between industry and the FDA as her capstone project, which was developed, essentially, she delivered a 50-page paper, so pretty substantive. And I applaud her on those efforts. And so what the objective of that was to identify the knowledge gap that exists between industry stakeholders and the role of the FDA in regards to cannabis. So we have some FDA experts on this panel, and Karen, welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Wow, this is amazing. I'm not sure I can pay attention. Look at that view. Anyway, it's an incredible honor to be here and to speak to this and have conversation with this incredibly esteemed panel, which I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves so we can just really get into the meat of so many of these issues, and we can tease them apart and just have conversation about them. So I'm going to send it on to Kristine.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here. I'm living in Washington, D.C. and working in Washington, D.C., but I actually grew up in Arlington, Mass., and I attended Boston University. My father actually taught there, so I'm, it's really good to be home. A little bit about me. I am an attorney at the law firm of Arnold and Porter. I'm in the what we call the Legislative Practice and Public Policy Group, which means we lobby. We are registered lobbyists. We represent a variety of clients. I focus on healthcare clients, so sampling of some of the clients that I work with. And this is public because I'm registered lobbyist for them. But for instance, the American Geriatric Society, the several children's hospitals. We represent some research institutes, and including a brain research institute, which is very interesting. And we've also done some behind the scenes work on some of the research legislation and some work on transportation legislation with respect to impairment studies that involve cannabis. I am co-chair of the Public Policy Committee for the Council for Federal Cannabis Regulation. I find this topic endlessly fascinating because it brings together so many different issues. The contrast of the contradiction of the states being so far ahead of the federal government, and the long and sordid history of criminalization of marijuana use, and the disparities in criminal enforcement, the nexus of an agency like DEA and FDA and the states, and or the lack of a nexus. And I started my career in law. I went 3,000 miles away to UCLA for law school, and I started as an assistant U.S. attorney, so civil, but I worked with the DEA, among other agencies, as a client with respect to diversion controls, and diversion programs. So learned a little bit about how they think. I also did a stint at the Department of Justice's headquarters, where I was in the Legislative Affairs Office and got to see the DEA sort of, in their policy milieu and how they think. And after a spin on the Hill, working on both sides, both chambers, I went to the Obama administration and worked on implementation of the Affordable Care Act, and also got to know the FDA from a different perspective of sort of defending them before Congress, tearing our hair out about things that they were doing, and then having to defend them with Congress. So at any rate, this is a multifaceted and fascinating policy area, and I'm really looking forward to our panel discussion today.
Well, hello. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. I'm just really excited to be talking to you today on this panel. I am a professor at Boston University School of Law, taught there since 2001. Yeah, and I taught mostly administrative law, environmental law, and constitutional law until about 7 years ago when a casebook rep, a person from one of the companies that sells law teaching materials, came to my office and said, "We have this new book about marijuana law that somebody from Vanderbilt had written. Do you know anybody on the faculty who might be interested in teaching cannabis law?" And I think she knew that I would be the one who would want to teach cannabis law. So I said, let's see what the dean says. And so everybody was really happy about it at the law school, actually. And so I've been teaching a cannabis law class for, I think I've taught it 6 or 7 times now. And beginning before Massachusetts had voted to legalize for adult use, up through, and I'm teaching it again in the fall. It's in room 420, if you're wondering where we teach it. The registrar actually now gives that to me without me asking. I think that's progress. And so I've been doing a lot of researching and writing about cannabis law for the last 7 years or so, and just published a book from University of California Press called Weed Rules, which was actually the name of the course that my associate dean had suggested when I was teaching the class. Why don't you call it Weed Rules? But decided not to, but it's a good name for a book, I thought. And the point of that book, the thesis of that book, just so you know where I'm coming from, is as an enthusiastic cannabis user myself. Basically, the idea of the book is that I think even in states that have legalized cannabis so far, much less the feds and Idaho, but even in the states that have legalized so far, they've done so under this grudging tolerance model that's really all that people talk about in the drug policy literature. And I think that's a mistake, and I've tried to put forth a case for treating cannabis with what I call cautious exuberance rather than grudging tolerance. Cautious because cannabis does pose, of course, some dangers, but exuberant because after all these years, nearly a century of racist and unscientific prohibition on cannabis, we finally have begun to recognize that this is actually a great substance for so many people that brings not just relief to patients, but also joy and euphoria to many adult users. That we ought to not be so grudging about it. In fact, states should embrace all of the benefits of cannabis, and that includes the joy that it brings to people who use it. So that's where I come from, and look forward to talking about federal policy.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bryant Godfrey. I'm a partner and co-chair of Foley Hoag's FDA practice located in the firm's Washington, D.C. office. My practice is I'm a FDA practitioner. I advise clients across all FDA-regulated industries, so drug, device, food, dietary supplements, personal care products, tobacco product policy. And with respect to cannabis, it's more so cannabis-derived products and just helping companies understand FDA's unspoken enforcement discretion and potentially where the FDA is headed just in general with respect to cannabis and cannabis-derived products. I did spend close to a decade at FDA in various positions within the agency. When I left FDA, I left when Dr. Califf was replaced by Dr. Gottlieb. So I did spend some time actually working with Dr. Califf, and he's actually the commissioner now at FDA. It's good to be here.
Thank you, all three of you. So it's with this cautious exuberance that I'd like to move into federal conversation. And, you know, with the tensions that we have in the federal arena and the variety of buffet options that we have as state regulation, you know, it creates issues with patients and consumers in situations like employment and work opportunities. And so I think in some of that, you know, I'm in the middle of reading Jay's book, which is a wonderful book. I want to tell him how much I appreciate his book, and he signed it and made a picture in there for me. So get you a book and he'll draw on yours too. But, you know, I think it's, he has a chapter on the employment ramifications that this regulation it causes, you know, from state level to federal level. So I'm just going to bring that to Jay. Jay, can you talk about those issues?
Sure, and I'll try to talk. Yeah, and try to frame it in terms of the federal response, possible federal response. I think it's the premise. I think of my remarks would be that the continuing common practice of employees firing or not hiring employees because they have used cannabis or use cannabis off the job. And the failure of states to protect those employees from the negative employment action of employers is a huge problem for medical cannabis and for public health. Not to mention the exuberance part. Lots of employers are still testing employees for cannabis, and many people are. In my book, I talk about a few examples of people being fired for cannabis use, and we're talking about use off. You know, nobody's saying that you can be high on the job, though. If you can do the job while you're high, well, we'll bracket that. But you know, if people are being fired for just using medical cannabis at night when they're not at the job, and that strikes me as unjust and just terrible idea. Now, lots of and the federal government, of course, is mostly terrible with all of this, right? So not only can you not use cannabis when you have a federal job, but of course many people are not allowed to get the job in the first place because you're asked about cannabis use. Now, and I remember my own when I worked at the Justice Department. I still remember after I had this long conversation with the FBI guy, and I said, "Yeah, I've used cannabis before," and at that time I had not used it all that much. He called me one Sunday morning, the FBI guy, and said, "I just wanted to follow up one thing. You said that you use cannabis. Where did you get it?" I'm like, it's Sunday morning. My wife gave it to me because I thought there was a privilege or something. I didn't really. But anyways, so if you work for the feds, you can't use cannabis. Now there's some good news, and in fact, very recently there's been some good news about this. Like some of the agencies, like even the CIA and the FBI, are sort of reducing the amount of time that they ask about your past cannabis use. It used to be, you couldn't have used it for 3 years or 7 years. In some of these places, it's now 1 year or 90 days. And the Office of Personnel Management at the Justice in the federal government is coming up with new forms. They'll ask about less time and stuff. So there's good news for that, but it's still the case that if you work for the federal government, you can't use cannabis. In the private sector, a lot of companies have stopped testing for cannabis, like Apple, for example, but a lot still do. And so people are getting fired or not applying because they know that they can't because they won't pass the drug test. And that's where policy comes in, because states can and many have in different contexts prohibited employers from taking these negative actions against employees. Some states it's just the medical patients who are protected. Some states it's medical patients are protected by statute. Some it's by court decision. In Massachusetts, it's a great court decision that came out a few years ago. But a lot of states don't protect workers at all. And as we move towards federal legislation, right, what I think all of this indicates is that we have had all these years of state experimentation. We can look at what the states have done. Some states have protected employees. Some states have protected medical but not recreational employees. Some states have not protected anybody. And we can, at the congressional level, now look at what's going on and sort of pick the best things for a national policy if Congress so chooses. And I think that Congress, when we're talking about this particular part of policy, federal policy, Congress should, when it legalizes, take action, if it can, politically. You're going to tell me that nothing is going to actually happen, but ideally, it's worth talking about the ideals, right? Should protect employees from being fired or not hired in the first place for using cannabis when not at work. So I'll leave it there.
That was great. Thanks, Jay. I will also, just remind everybody that not only are we not getting job protections for medical patients in cannabis, you're not covered under the ADA for disability, which is included in this protection for employment, but also in housing and those types of drug-free zones, in schools, and that's been an issue in states, and maybe we'll hear some of that from the states too. But the tension with federal is so tight, and that I think there's a lot of confusion. And some of the conversations that I had in the paper that I wrote was the misunderstanding of the role of the FDA. Like what can the FDA do in this circumstance with a Schedule I substance? And so in the past, I would say 6 months, Dr. Janet Wilcox, Dr. Cornier have had some really strong discussions about what their roles are, what their what policies and infrastructure is in place within the drug development, the IND process, the investigatory new drug process, and then with the hemp-derived cannabinoids that we are seeing proliferate, and we talked about, Dr. Shish talked about. So, Bryant, I'd like to send it to you, and we had some great prelim lunch discussions about how to sort of pitch these, just complex ideas in this short amount of time that we have. So, Bryant, go for it. Let's talk about where the FDA is in these particular matters, and what can the FDA do, and what are we waiting for?
Very good question. I'm going to try my best in the little amount of time that we do have here. So, FDA on the books technically can do a lot, but with respect to actually how does that play out in the day-to-day, given the resource scarcity that the agency they can't keep people, and there's not a lot of people to do enforcement, et cetera. Even though they have the authority in certain cases, it doesn't really mean anything if you don't have teeth behind enforcing it. So from a therapeutic perspective, what we've seen FDA do over the last maybe 5-7 years, they've introduced the notion to industry, hey, we would love to see cannabis come before us. Well, look at the data, they've actually opened the door to that. But even more recently, we're starting to see FDA kind of make even more statements to the public. I'm going to read just a few of them just to give you a highlight as to what FDA may be up to. The agency has stated to date, the FDA has not approved a marketing application for cannabis for the treatment of any disease or condition. The FDA has not approved any other cannabis-derived, or CBD products currently available on the market. FDA is aware that unapproved cannabis or unapproved cannabis-derived products are being used to treat a number of medical conditions, including AIDS wasting, epilepsy, neuropathic pain, spasticity associated with multiple sclerosis, and cancer and chemotherapy-induced nausea. Caregivers and patients can be confident that FDA-approved drugs have been carefully evaluated for safety, efficacy, and quality, and are monitored by FDA once they are on the market. However, the use of unapproved cannabis and cannabis-derived products can have unpredictable and unintended consequences, including serious safety risks. Also, there has been no FDA review of data from rigorous clinical trials to support that these unapproved products are safe and efficacious for the various therapeutic uses for which they are being used. And then it pivots and says, FDA understands the need to develop therapies for patients with unmet medical needs and does everything it can to facilitate this process. And it talks about the different programs that are available. Through these programs and the drug approval process, FDA supports sound, scientifically based research into the medicinal uses of drug products containing cannabis or cannabis-derived compounds, and will continue to work with companies interested in bringing safe and effective and quality products to market. That has been the most that I've seen FDA say with respect to cannabis, and it's been a complete sea change almost. And I'm wondering if this is maybe showing the signs of where we may be. We know that the states for the longest time have regulated medicinal marijuana. We have FDA saying these things, like, what are we talking about, FDA? Are you going to get in the business? Are you actually going to get in the business of actually actively regulating that? And people are saying, well, Brian, how can FDA do that? Well, in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, there are different categories of products that FDA has jurisdiction over, and it's basically defined in the statute. And any article that is intended for the cure, mitigation, treatment, prevention of disease in man or animals, that's considered a drug, and FDA technically under the law can go after those products. FDA has not been going after medicinal marijuana for forever. So is this a sign that FDA may want to start looking into that because they're encouraging research to be done and stuff to be submitted to the agency? I don't know. That's something that we definitely want to keep an eye on. I would say in the CBD space, FDA has been pretty much exercising enforcement discretion, kind of like, we know it when we see it, when it's bad, we'll send a letter. CBD is illegal, and with respect to its inclusion in food and dietary supplements in the Act, there is an exclusionary clause that says if an article is approved as a drug product or was in clinical trials for it being investigated as a drug, that it cannot be placed in food and dietary supplements. We all know that CBD is in food and dietary supplements. We see Dr. Woodcock saying, hey, Congress, we need more authority for Congress, because right now the FDA is not going to we're not going to issue a regulation illegally allowing it to be in food and dietary supplements, but we need Congress to give us more teeth to figure out how are they going to actually regulate CBD. So that's a long-winded way of saying, we don't know where FDA is going. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for industry to get involved while FDA is in the stage of trying to figure things out, what type of authority they want to approach Congress for. This is a perfect time to start engaging with FDA on these issues. So that's what I want to say about that.
Thanks, Bryant. And the FDA has responded in some particulars by an acceleration plan for developing products and offering that as a quick in. And they've also have created the right to try, which some of our new research is doing the research with patients under the Right to Try Act, I think of 2017, which is very helpful. But in that space of research, it's a nice kind of segue if that's what we're needing. So we just passed on December 2nd, was it? Yeah, December 2nd of
which I thought was a cool anniversary because that's an anniversary of the single narcotics treaty. That's that changed cannabis in 2020. So anyway, on December 2nd, the United States said, okay, we're going to pass this expansion research act to support research moving forward. And Kristine, you did a wonderful advisory article about that on the day after that came through. So how, a little bit about it. And then we're 6 months into it and we have to report on it in December.
We do. Well, we do, they do,
Right.
DEA.
They do, the collective we.
Yeah. So a little bit about the background of how that bill came together. And I will also address briefly whether the bill accomplishes what people think it accomplishes, because it raises some questions about whether it actually creates more barriers to research involving cannabis that go beyond its the Schedule I status of the substance. So, but how it came together is a little interesting because there's obviously been a lot of interest in advancing research. One would think it is something that could be a bipartisan effort to kind of expedite so that we can see what are the benefits of the medical benefits of this product. Dianne Feinstein had been a long-time champion of this bill, and her version of the bill was always very, I would say, pharmaceutical oriented in the sense that it clearly contemplated an IND kind of process, a molecule by molecule kind of process, and it still does. I mean, that the way that it passed. On the House side, Earl Blumenauer, who's long been a champion, established the Congressional Cannabis Caucus. He had a sort of broader view and really wanted to include, for purposes of research, the products that are actually available in dispensaries in various states, and to do research on what people are actually using, as opposed to at the time when he started down the road with this bill, the University of Mississippi basically had a monopoly on cannabis for research purposes. So the House version was always a little bit different than the Senate version. But they eventually, in the last Congress, attracted some Republican interest. And I think this is so ironic because the Republican co-sponsor in the last Congress was Andy Harris, the congressman from Maryland, who's a physician, anesthesiologist, and he is on the Appropriations Committee, and he's actually the one who led the blocking of the District of Columbia's effort to have legal cannabis. And I think his view is that, well, the research is good because we'll show how dangerous this substance is. But nonetheless, they at least came together to try and streamline some of the processes for research, because so many researchers have been really complaining about the fact that the source was very restricted with the University of Mississippi, just unavailable and not great in quantity or diversity in terms of, for research purposes. And that it was extremely cumbersome to work with DEA, long delays for getting permits for doing research. Just before the bill passed, at least a couple of years before the bill passed, the DEA did start opening up more licenses. That had taken them for quite a while to do, but they started opening up licenses to various quote grows that now we have 7, I believe, including University of Mississippi, that are limited to. I mean, they can't open well, I guess they could just open a dispensary, but the purpose of DEA licensing them was to amplify and expand the sources of product for purposes of research. And so remains to be seen how well the grows are going to do in terms of, really accelerating what's going on. The interesting quandary is that if, I know we're going to talk about rescheduling, descheduling, et cetera, but if marijuana gets rescheduled, and drops to lower than Schedule 1, this statute, as enacted, sort of becomes a bar to. It creates a unique category. So marijuana would still be treated as if it were a Schedule 1 drug for purposes of these research provisions, as opposed to, and even though technically wouldn't be a Schedule 1 product. So Congress, in its infinite wisdom, will probably, at some point, have to sync up with any rescheduling that occurs at the agency level with DEA and FDA. One last thing on research. This year, 2 members of the Nevada congressional delegation introduced another research bill that would specifically help institutions of higher education make clear, for instance, that is the safe drug or safe campus law would not apply to research conducted on their campuses. Would establish an office at DEA to liaison with institutions of higher education. So to help them through the application process, et cetera. But again, the overall flavor of these laws is sort of assuming that we are going to have a very linear pharmaceutical type pathway for purposes of how what the end game is with respect to the products that might come about because of research.
Yeah, and those 7, 3 are inclined and intending research with veterans and first responders, PTSD. 1 is in phase 2 of a PTSD and cannabis research with inhalation as a route of administration, using some Michigan adult 21 regulated donations from state. So, we talked about those grants, coming in and for research. Michigan's adult use is supporting one of those research, which is millions of dollars, right? I think it's average of $1 million to do research in 10 years. If we're going to average it out. So, we've got a long way to go, and there's been a lot of research, but how robust is that research? And how accessible is it? I spoke to an academic researcher recently who reiterated the same thing you said, Kristine, was, how can we use what people are using? How can we research? And that's complicated, and we need to figure that out. But let's go ahead and talk about the reschedule, deschedule conversation, and what does that mean? And I think so many people, they do some research, they take a look at rescheduling. There's a lot of implications, whether it goes to 2, 3, 4, 5, and what's involved in that, as far as removing the barriers for access. And then you go into pharmacy when Brian's talking about that, and how pharmacy deals with various scheduled drugs and doctors, and how they're able to prescribe them, and how we're able to do research. But in the whole, does descheduling mean legalizing? Does reschedule not? So let's kick that around for a little bit. What do we think about that whole process? Anybody want to start it off? Jay, you're shrieking back, but.
You want to go?
So first of all, I think probably everybody here knows, but it's worth saying that even descheduling does not get us out of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act regulatory process. I mean, FDA still has an obligation to make sure that foods and drugs, et cetera, are safe for the general public. And so, I mean, that sometimes, it seems to get conflated, like, it's just going to be, the federal government will just get out of the way if we deschedule. What appears to be going on now is that there is a really serious effort underway at FDA and DEA to follow the President Biden's directive from October to examine whether cannabis should be rescheduled. I mean, FDA has been sort of making some semi-public noises about that and mentioning the fact that they're working on it. We don't know, obviously, where they're going to come out, but they and the DEA are bound by an 8-factor analysis that's in the statute. It's in the Controlled Substances Act. The 8 factors, I think of them mostly as largely about risk of abuse, risk of diversion, very little in terms of the benefit, potential medical benefit, but the 8 factors do look to what is the currently accepted medical use, which everybody is sort of, well, obviously it's being used for medical purposes. Doctors are recommending it, et cetera. So, but FDA and DEA have come out, even in the Obama administration, have come out in prior attempts at rescheduling, very firmly keeping marijuana in Schedule 1. We've heard Secretary Becerra, Secretary of HHS, say some things to the effect that kind of hinting that things have changed. We have new learning. We have new experience to look to, one would think, because we do have a well-regulated state market, or at least fairly well-regulated state market in so many states. And we do have, for instance, if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, where you can see where are all the pending clinical trials, some of which have reported out their results, and you just run a search for the word cannabis or marijuana or a cannabinoid, you can see that there is a tremendous amount of work being done in terms of including in foreign countries, but also in the United States with academic institutions and with companies, et cetera. Some of those companies, I think, not maybe yet appearing on clinicaltrials.gov, are pharmaceutical companies. But they're starting to dip their toes in the water a little bit, and they're certainly keeping an eye on what's going on with rescheduling. So if I had to guess, I would think that we're going to see a decision before the presidential election, and it'll be very interesting. I just personally, I think it's hard for me to believe that they're going to wind up being back in Schedule 1 for a variety of reasons. If they end up putting cannabis in Schedule 3, 4, or 5, that's a whole different ballgame. We avoid the 280E problem for the industry, and then you're really talking. But then you're opening up a whole other can of worms, which is basically DEA is still in the ballgame, still tracking, still doing inventory, still requiring a registered pharmacy to dispense the drug, and that is just a system that isn't synchronous with the current model that the industry is operating with dispensaries. And so then you've got to face a whole nother set of policy questions about, do we use that model and we put a pharmacist in every dispensary, or do we put the do we bring the product in at CVS and so at any rate, I mean, the federal government, as usual, taking quite a long time to sort of figure all of this out, and stymied by politics along the way. So remains to be seen.
You know, and as we continue on that, you know, part of my my paper was I had the opportunity to talk to Joanne Cheedy. And Joanne, you know, was the Inspector General of HHS, overseeing about $3 trillion worth of policy and programs, you know, and she said, you know, cannabis is such a complex issue. I mean, we have patients, we have safety to think about, but we also, and an industry to think about, we have compliance and standardization, and we also have an ecosystem to think about. You know, I don't know if you have any idea what an indoor grow takes, you know, in resources, you know, and that sort of thing. So there's so many agencies involved in this really incredible, complex problem. And I think we're up to it. You know, I think we have great minds in this industry. We have continued learning. We have an evolved sense of consciousness about it. And it's exciting to be here and to kind of fix this puzzle. What do you think, Jay?
Yes. Totally agree. I mean, I don't have much to add about this, except I do find the argument about whether descheduling is, I think maybe this is a wrong assumption, but most of the people I've talked to think descheduling is the gold standard. And then the question is rescheduling, as opposed to descheduling, a step forward or a step backward? And that's an interesting question, right? If certainly there's an argument out there that if cannabis is rescheduled to category 3, 4, or 5, that takes the steam out of the movement to completely deschedule. On the other hand, one could argue, is like Shane Pennington has, and that rescheduling can't be worse than keeping it in category in Schedule 1, because there are also incremental benefits from bringing it down to 3, 4, 5, or whatever. But I think that's a hard question. But I used to be really persuaded by the treating marijuana like it's cocaine instead of heroin isn't that big of a jump of a benefit, but on the other hand, maybe it is sort of a benefit. So anyways, I think that's the rescheduling versus descheduling issue is really interesting to me, and I don't know how I think about it anymore.
How about you, Bryant? What are you thinking?
Yeah, just to add on to what Kristine said, from an FDA perspective, it doesn't really bother or kind of mess with what FDA does. What we've seen historically with Schedule 1 substances that eventually get approved as FDA-approved drugs, they are rescheduled with DEA. So that's business as usual. To some of the other categories regulated by FDA, the scheduling or not, rescheduling does not interfere with what FDA does currently. So from an FDA perspective, it doesn't really matter.
Right. And I think people need to consider that there are many pharmacy drugs that you are being prescribed, on whatever basis that you are, that are not scheduled, but they are oversought by pharmacy, they're oversought by prescription process. And so that's something to consider. So I'd like to open it up to some Q&A. We've had some provocative conversations, and here comes Lauren, and Jenny's bringing you the mic.
I was just going to say, if you're coming to TPAD, just hide from me, because I'll want all of the answers. So when we talk, Bryant, about, and I think there's this narrative out there, FDA won't do anything with it. Don't worry about it. So while it's possible, it's not probable, but we also look at, what if they don't do anything about us? They don't treat us like farmer. They don't treat us in any different way than we're treated now under this administration. Personal politics aside, a new administration comes in. I just like opinions on kind of how that dynamic could or maybe would change absent something like the Cole memo being in place. Just curious on that topic.
Yeah, even now, there has been a working group within FDA between different administrations, under the Trump administration, under the Obama administration, now under Biden's administration, within the agency that is tasked with looking at just cannabis policy just generally. I don't see that being dismantled. I think even with Dr. Wilcox's statement to, hey, Congress, we need more authority, that might be the opening the door potentially for a different product center. We saw with tobacco, they now have the Center for Tobacco Products. If FDA gets their way and if Congress can play nicely together, we don't know how long that's going to be. There might be a center for cannabis at FDA that's been talked about. But currently, as is, there is an intra-agency working group that has been in existence for a while, and it's lasted across different administrations.
So to build on, I think something that was said earlier regarding the FDA and the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and essentially the three lanes that these products would fall under, to keep it simple, right? Dietary, food, or pharma. And then you tie that into the rescheduling versus deschedule conversation that, yes, the Secretary via the AG and the Biden administration mandated to do. One question I have is, what is cannabis? And what I mean by that is, how do we ever expect them to conduct a reschedule when cannabis means the edibles that Wana creates that are phenomenal. It means THC, high THC flower from 20% to 30%, potentially 40%, depending on what lab you go to. It means topical. It means something with high CBD. So we don't have a product characterization for them to look at this. And when you bring it back to a drug model, that's one active ingredient and excipients or inactives. So we don't have a framework. So I don't see how this is even possible without that type of framework, which goes back to something the FDA said even more recently than January. I think that came out in January as well, but then February and has been reiterated since, is we look forward to working with Congress on a new framework forward. And I think one of you guys said this as well, that this is an opportunity for the industry to actually work together, because the state regulators, I'll be with them in 2 weeks. I am an advisor, I have liaison with them and standards organizations. They're looking for solutions as well. The industry needs solutions. The FDA wants a solution. We all have to go back to Congress. So long way to bring it to a question of, like, do you see us, how do we work together on this? Or do we not even have to work together because how else do we reschedule? I don't know.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. That is the central question. That's also the central question with respect to any sort of rescheduling or descheduling. What is it that there are botanical drugs. I actually looked at right. And well, there's I don't know if you're including this cocaine derivative that's DAT-SCAN. It's basically a methamphetamine one too. So, and those go through, those are generally applications sponsored by pharmaceutical companies, and they're sort of, they can refine it down to, even though it's a botanical, kind of a single molecule, what's the operable molecule there. And cannabis is just a very different, and it is a very complex plant. So I do think that they grapple with that. I think that's one of the reasons why, we've fallen back into Schedule 1 repeatedly, even after various petitions. I think, Congress, I've always thought this is a congressional problem. Congress enacted the Controlled Substances Act. Congress enacted the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. If they don't fit something that is currently needed by people for medical purposes, wanted by people for recreational and joy purposes, and to enhance their quality of life, then Congress needs to be responsive to its constituents. And I fervently believe that with the Farm Bill coming up for reauthorization this year, if the industry doesn't, and all of the stakeholders don't come together and launch a serious effort on the Hill to make people aware, make members aware, I don't care, whether they're part of the Freedom Caucus or who they are. If constituents come to them and basically say, we need this, I want to educate you, and we want, and you've got a legislative vehicle that can be used to create a more rational system. This Congress, on the House side, we've had a few startup issues, 15 votes to get a speaker installed. They're having a little bit of trouble in terms of resources for FDA, which they do sorely need if they're going to get even new authorities, let alone have their current authorities work. We are probably going to go into a continuing resolution situation this year, which means we will, because of the debt ceiling deal, the budget, our overall budget will drop by 1% for domestic spending. So the FDA will have even fewer resources if that happens. So, this is a long fight, and this is something that it doesn't just, legislation doesn't just happen. We make it happen.
Thank you, Kristine. Thank you, everyone.